I'm
Yes, Marco. Okay.
I've started now. So let me do like a quick, just welcome thing, and then I will let you have the stage.
Sure.
I'm gonna do that part a bit in Turkish, so just to be like sure. Herkese selam. Bugün bu Türkiye'de konuğumuz Marco Roth. Kendisi bize Leveling Up Developer Tooling for the Modern Rails and Hotwire Era adlı sunumunu yapacak. Daha hani modern bir Ruby on Rails ve işte Hotwire ile alakalı son kısımlar gibi çok böyle özetleyebiliriz. E, Sunumun noktasından sonrası İngilizce. O yüzden ben de İngilizceye dönüyorum. Marco, I think you can start.
Awesome. Let me try to figure this out. Uh. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, then let me pull this over and then. All right, then welcome. Thanks for having me here at the Ruby Turkey meetup. It's great to see that there are so many online meetups happening and also so many in-persons again. And yeah, thanks for having me. Today I want to talk about the modern Rails and Hotwire tooling. I am Mark Roth. If you haven't met, I would love to chat after or reach me on any of the socials online. Um, this talk is more about to kind of give you an insight of what it takes to build these tools and kind of give you some, I guess, transparency that it's not that hard to build these tools and kind of help contribute to make these tools happen. So what we're going to do today is kind of trying to understand the language server protocol, the LSP for short, building a simple LSP, and then kind of show you what's next for tooling. I've been on the StimulusReflex and Cape-Ready core teams for the past few years, and I've been maintaining Stimulus as well for the last 2 or so years. So this kind of gave me all these insights that I kind of had to kind of build these tools, and it really made it my job easy to build these tools. So I love open source. I have been doing this for a few years now, and I really think I had an awesome journey so far. I was able to contribute to all of these tools I listed here and probably many more, but most of them you can see here are somewhat related to Turbo, to Hotwire, to Stimulus, or in some way to that. I've also built a few other tools, and I want to focus on one of them briefly because that's kind of what we are doing today as well. So we have been building this website called Ruby Video. In the past few months or so, we have been really focusing on adding more and more data to it. And I'm happy to announce that as of today, we also have the Ruby Turkey meetup on there too. So I'm hoping that we can also add the future ones and including this one there too. So this is just a way to show that all these events are happening. We are a really awesome community and we have all of these tools and videos and talks available on this website now. It gives you kind of a list of all the talks and you can see what's happening and you get the recent ones there too. So if you haven't seen this, check this out. It's on rubyvideo.dev/organization/Ruby Turkey. And there you can see this one and I guess the future ones as well. But to come go back to the topic of today, I started to actively contribute in 2019. And at the time, I was working at the job where we were using React. But I kind of had enough of that, I would say mindset, right? I love Ruby, I love Rails, and I want to keep building these Rails and Hotwire apps because that's just the way I think and the way my brain works. And it feels like it gives me this kind of superpower to just build these apps however the way I want them to build. But also, I think they are the future of modern Rails apps. And I wanted to going back to do these full stack apps, build these apps because it's just so much more productive. But I also started to miss these modern tooling that I was used to from the React and JavaScript ecosystem. And that's kind of why I wanted to go for a few years full-time on open source to just build out some of these tools. And I had a lot of fun doing so. So during the time between 2022 and 2023, I was doing pretty much full-time open source for the fun of it. Mostly to work on these Hotwire and related projects. And yeah, I noticed something. These React tools, they had really awesome developer experience and they really made me more productive doing the work I was doing. But it didn't seem like we have something similar in the Ruby world. It seems like we were lacking that. Or if there were tools, they weren't really as easy to get started and set up. In React world, you just install, use your editor, you open the project, and it just works. You don't have to install and configure anything. It pretty much just works out of the box. With Ruby, we had this solo graph language server for the longest time, but it's kind of felt that something is wrong with it, or I never could it figured out how to set it up, or it was always kind of annoying to get it started with it. So I felt like we have to improve that experience to get more people to use these tools. And yeah, I started to miss working with these tools I was used to in the React world. I am not the person who uses an IDE in that sense. They always kind of felt clunky and heavyweight for me to use. And I was just wanted something lightweight that just works and is reliable. But in the last few years, stuff changed a little bit. We got kind of editor evolution going on, I think, and that's thanks to the language server protocol. So what is that protocol and why do we want to use it? It's kind of the way of sharing knowledge between the server, like the language knowledge, and the editor. So we can communicate between these two. So it's like a language intelligence tools without having the need for a custom-built IDE for that programming language. So you can think of this as this. Before we had the LSP, we would have to build a plugin for each of the editors to add support for Ruby, for JavaScript, or whatever else you have. But thanks to the LSP, we can build one language server, and because it supports the standard protocol, all of the editors that support the protocol too just support it out of the box. If you want to think in terms of like Ruby and Rails parallels, you can think of LSP as like rack. Rack kind of connects the web servers and like the frameworks, and it's just this common interface that you can use to build these tools. So how does it work? Whenever you open a file that's associated with one language, your editor starts a background process, which is the server itself, and it keeps running and keeps serving these requests. You can think of this as like a web server, and your client being the editor that just makes requests to that server. Usually this happens over standard in or standard out. We can also configure it to do it over TCP/IP, but it's less common. And it uses a protocol called JSON RPC, which if you aren't familiar with it, it's kind of similar to HTTP, and it looks a little bit like this. So you have the headers up top as well. You have some body. In this case, it's just a JSON blob. And here we can see it just has the JSON RPC, it has a version, it has an ID, and it has some methods and params that you can pass along it. In the LSP, we have some messages that we can send between the client and the server. Usually these are the requests, response, and notification messages. But what we mostly care about are the text document synchronization. So whenever you open a file in your editor, or you save a file, or you close a file, your editor sends a notification request to the server to notify the server about the files that changed. So we, as the server implementers, can react to those events. And this brings us to the StimulusLSP today, and we kind of want to talk about what we're trying to solve here. So when you are building out a Stimulus application, you have this markup here. This is the most basic example from the website. But what you really care about here are the attributes that are the controllers, the targets, the actions, and so on, all the ones that are related to Stimulus. And what we want to do is when we kind of start to write our HTML, we want to have an autocomplete to give us all the possible values or attributes that are valid in this context. So in this example here, we want to show all the possible controllers, all the possible targets, and everything that you might have in your application. So if you complete this controller, you get to the value, and then you want to autocomplete the value here too. So if you type this out, you get the user profile control, for example, here. But if you noticed, I made this on purpose, so it should actually be user dash profile. And that's kind of the common problem that we saw with kind of people using Stimulus, that it's so easy to make these mistakes. It's just like so easy to make these typos, And you don't really get any feedback from the framework at all of what's actually wrong. It just doesn't work. It doesn't give you any output, nothing. So I thought we can do better. We want to support the people to write better stimulus controllers or code. So back a few years, I was looking it up and just thought, yeah, let's see how we can build this. So I found this documentation, and it's about building an extension for VS Code. And it had this repo with all the examples, and I found this specific LSP example. In here, it just had this basic interaction where you have a text document, you have some text, and it will always give you two options to choose from, just like an autocomplete. So let's see how this basic example works here. So when you open this file, it sends this request to the server. So what we see here is a text document completion request. It sends along the text document with like the path to where this file is, the position of where your cursor currently is, and some more parameters that we don't really care about for right now. And the server can do anything to actually generate a response, but it has to respond to this request with a JSON blob. In this example, we return this JSON blob where we have a result. It's an array, and it contains some of these objects, and the label is what you actually see in your editor. And when the client receives this, it just displays it as like this drop-down dialog. So if we go back to our stimulus example, we have a similar situation here. We have HTML here. We want to autocomplete these attributes. The only difference here is that we are dealing with a embedded language. So here we have HTML that already is a standard. There already is a completion mechanism in most editors for HTML. So we have to extend the existing HTML behavior, which is why we talk about embedded languages. The stimulus grammar or the stimulus attributes are not part of this HTML spec. It just uses data attributes, and you can pretty much choose arbitrary data attributes. It doesn't really define how that works. So we have to find a way to extend the HTML-like documents to make this happen. And you can do this thanks to language services. Now we have to talk about how we implement one of those. And most commonly, you have to ask, in which language do you implement this in? We are Ruby developers, so ideally we would want to use Ruby for this. But realistically speaking, we have a lot of frameworks that are using Hotwire. So it felt kind of weird to require Ruby to be installed for all of these other frameworks and languages to use this LSP. So we decided to just use TypeScript for now to just make it more portable so we can use the existing data providers and reuse the existing language services. And speaking of that, luckily the VS Code organization actually exposes a language service for HTML already. So we can just plug into this and implement very easily with that. All we have to do here is to implement a data provider. And data providers look something like this. So you have a class that you extend from or implement from an interface that is package exports. And you have to implement these three methods to make it work. So let's implement them. First up is the provide tags. And this one is to extend new tags to the HTML syntax, HTML tags. But since we are using data attributes for our markup, we don't really need any new tags. We just need more attributes. So all we have to do here is pretty much just return an empty array because we don't care about these tags for now. More interestingly, we have to provide attributes that we want to provide more to the editor. So here we have this list of common attributes you might use with Stimulus. Some of them are dynamic and some of them are static. So the static ones up here are easy to implement. So let's start with those. What we do here is also return an array. And in here, we just return a object or objects with a name attribute. And with that, we pretty much just have this implemented already. So this works for the static ones. But now let's look at the dynamic ones. The problem here is that these dynamic ones are dependent on our application. So we have to know which controls you have in your application and which classes targets these controls implement in your application too, or in your controllers. So we have to parse JavaScript, or more specifically, we have to parse our stimulus controllers to see what these controllers hold in them. And for that, we implement a control definition class, which just holds the reference to where this file is and what these controllers expose. So the methods, the targets, the classes, and the values. We use Acorn for this, which is a JavaScript parser, and don't really have to know all the details here, but we just implement a parser class. It has a parse controller method. We take in the code, which is the source code and the file name. And when you pass in, or when you look at this file here, for example, our hello controller, which looks like this, it has two targets, the name and the outputs. It has some methods on it. And what we really care about here is just the targets and the method names. You don't really care about what's in the method themselves. So what we can do is write some code in JavaScript to go over all these files. We have a glob to look for all these controllers. We loop over all of them, read the files, and pass the source codes and the files into our parser parse controller method. In that parse controller method, we can parse the code. We get back an abstract syntax tree, which just allows us to look into this file and how it's defined and what it's actually exposing. We instantiate a new control definition class, which we defined earlier. And what we do now in here is we traverse this abstract syntax tree and look for method definitions. And whenever we find one of those method definitions, we just take the name of it and push it into our methods array so we know which methods this control defines. And with that, we have the basic parser for parsing out all the method names our controller exposes. We do something very similar for the targets and for the other APIs we have. And this turns this controller with the targets and the method names into an instance of our control definition class that looks like this. We have the path, we have the methods as like strings of the methods it defines, and we have the two targets as strings, so we can actually work with that now. And with this information, we can go back to our dynamic attributes and now interpolate these values into our attributes here. So for our provide attributes method we want to implement, we can extend this now to loop over all our targets, interpolate the identifier of our controller, and then return all of these targets with the remaining static ones. And with this, we get a autocomplete that looks like this in our editor. So we have the action, the controller, which are the static ones, but we also now get the data hello target, which is because we have a hello controller in our application. So we kind of have already a good autocomplete and no understanding of our application. So let's say you complete this controller now, you are at this situation where you want to know which are the possible values for this controller. So you can implement this third method, the final one, which is the provide values method. We get in pass in a tag and the attributes. Again, we don't really care about the tag. It just has to be on the elements. But we actually care about the attribute in this case because we want to know which attribute we are trying to complete for. So when we see our attribute is our data controller attributes, we just return all the attributes we know, or all the identifiers we know from our controllers. And with that, we get the list of possible values for the controllers. If it doesn't match this, we can see to see if it matches the target attribute. And if it does, we can find the right controller. And if we have the right controller, we can return all the targets it defines. And with that, we get an autocomplete like this, where if you have the controller attribute, it gives us all the possible identifier names. And if we define data hello target attribute, it gives us all the targets that are valid on our controller. And with this, you shouldn't be making any typos anymore because you can just autocomplete this and it knows. So, okay, this was the basic idea of what I wanted to prove. So like after a long night of like working on this, I committed this up, had like initial commit and just let it sit for a few days. So a few days later, I was trying to see if this is actually something I want to work on more. And I just sent kind of a demo video of what I showed you just now to my friend. And he was pretty much saying yeah, please work on this more. Take my money. I want to have this more in my daily use. So I thought, what else can we do? We can extend this. We can make this even better. So the other question here now is, can't AI all do that right now in today's day and age? And I would say maybe, but I think there are different use cases here. So I feel like AI is great for boilerplate. You can generate a lot of code really quickly. But if you want to actually have accurate results and actually know that it is right, you want to have LSPs. Adding to that, the context window of the LLMs today are still very limited. And what we have here are like this location of the file. So our stimulus control sits here, our view files are over here, and it doesn't really understand the relation between those. So it's really not that great for that use case. But even if AI could do all of this, what we just showed you now, which would be great, so I don't have to do it anymore, so that's good. We still want to know about diagnostics. And the kind of inspiration for this was in Ruby itself. So whenever you use Ruby and kind of mistype a method, it always gives you this did you mean suggestion of what you could have meant, what's actually right. So this kind of inspired this new approach I had to say, if we see you misspelled something and we don't recognize this value, we can give you a suggestion of, did you actually mean this controller? And give it to the user. And we can do this for the controllers. We can do this for the actions. We can do this for targets. We can do it for pretty much everything, even for if you're using values and you are mismatching the types between what did you define in your controller and what did you have defined in your HTML. So what else can we do? If we already know something is not right, but could be right, we could kind of guide the user to do the right thing and give them a code action to fix it for them. So when we see we have this controller, it doesn't know about it, but it could say, did you mean hello? We could just say, replace this value with the right thing that we actually meant. Or if you're prototyping something and you're defining a controller that you don't exist yet, you can ask the LSP to create the file for you for the right name at the right location. So you don't have to think about all the naming and all the other things that go with it. So it just gives you some ways to work with that. And now fast forward a few years to October last year, where I felt comfortable enough releasing this whole thing. This was all kind of sitting in my work in progress. But last year I was finally happy with what I had. And I was able to release this at my Rails World talk last year. And thanks to the LSP protocol, we can just ship with all these compatible editors. So we don't have to do anything more. It just works with all of them. So if you aren't using it today, I would highly encourage you to give it a try. And if it doesn't work for you, we can see if we can improve it. So I released this thing. I asked for feedback for the community, and I got a lot of awesome feedback and new ideas. And I also started to see that some of these approaches we were taking started to fall short, especially the ones that were related to parsing, how we parse our JavaScript, because there's a lot of syntax in JavaScript. And with all the ES ECMAScript versions 5, 6, and now with all the version numbers, we didn't really support all of that. So we had to switch out the parser and make it work. So that was one learning. The other thing was, if you remember from earlier, this glob we had, we just hard-coded this string of where the controllers are, but it turns out not all the projects have the controller at these locations. So we had to make this more dynamic so we could actually detect where these controllers are. Then we had some issues with the identifiers. We cannot always assume that the file name is actually the same as the controller identifier because you could rename them, you could register them twice. You could do some weird things with it. So we had to account for that. And the other problem was the way you are initializing, instantiating all of your applications. So this example here is from the most recent version, how it is in default in Rails today. It uses the import maps, the seamless loading version, and it just eco loads all of these controls. But if you have been using Rails for a while, and there are some legacy applications too, You might have seen some of these bundlers, some of these approaches of how to build JavaScript. And if you're building a tool like this, you have to support pretty much all of these setups because people are using them and people wouldn't be able to use this tool if it wouldn't support that. So we had to make sure that it kind of works with all of these setups. And I think it does today. So if you can break it in any way in your application, please let me know and I will try to fix it. And the thing is, technically the language server works. It's actually doing its job. But if you can't really parse some of the parts of it, you get a lot of inaccurate results and false positives, which are super annoying to work with because you just want this tool to help you, not to be in your way. So as a user, this is super annoying. And that's why we focus on addressing all of these issues and fixed most of them. I think it's in a good shape today. And all of that kind of led to rebuild this parser from scratch. So it's not kind of what I showed today in the slides anymore. It's a little bit more complicated to support all of these setups. But what we get today for that, though, is a more accurate and more reliable parser that just works for all of these setups. So if you fast forward to 2024, early this year, I was able to release this parser. And with that, I was also able to release the Stimulus LSP 1.0 version, where I felt like this was super reliable. This works for most cases. So it added support for TypeScript, for inheritance, for importing controllers from NPM packages, and so much more. So all of that, I felt comfortable shipping. It was the 1.0 release, and that's kind of what you can have today. So what's next for this? Recently, RubyMine added support for Stimulus too. So it's kind of cool to see all these other editors catching up and adding support for that. So it just means there's something to it. There's something right about doing that and putting in all this effort. The other thing is all these diagnostics I showed you earlier are kind of locked into the editor now or into the LSP now. But it doesn't have to be. We can kind of extract that out and make it not exclusive to the LSP. So we can kind of run these diagnostics independently. You can think of it kind of like a tool as Rubocop. So you can just run this tool and it will go through all your files as like a CLI. And that's kind of what I want to do. I want to build a stimulus lint package that you can run independently from the LSP. And it will give you all the errors and diagnostics as I showed you. And you can run it as part of your CI or for your local setup to just make sure that you catch these errors early so you don't kind of ship them to production. The other thing is that we don't really support HTML and ERB super well, especially if you're using the Rails tag helpers for generating some of this in Ruby, which is outputting ERB, so HTML tags. So this doesn't quite work today, but we are working on this as well. We want to support the same diagnostics and code action in ERB, so that's kind of coming as well. And related to that, I was working with Turbo LSP, which has super basic support now. It's also available already, but it doesn't do much yet, just because it has the same problem. Turbo makes heavy use of these ERB helpers too. So we have to properly understand Turbo, ERB, and Rails tag helpers to make this more useful. So if you don't really understand ERB, we can't really provide any more intelligence as what we have today. So we have to make that work first to make it happen. So in the LSP for Stimulus understands HTML and ERB documents, but it doesn't understand Ruby that outputs HTML. And I kind of showed this in my slide last year at the Rails World Talk too. I had this thing up here that we want to support this as soon as the Ruby LSP supports ERB. And that kind of sparked this whole conversation with the Ruby LSP creator. And we kind of were talking about it back and forth and what that might mean for that. So last year at the Ruby Day, RubyConf Hack Day, we worked on it together to make ERB support happen in Ruby LSP. So we kind of sat together and we're working on this to just see what it takes to add a basic implementation of that. We quickly realized that it isn't that straightforward as we thought, as usual in software engineering. So there's that. But the approach we were taking is something like this. So if you have this markup here, we were just stripping out all the HTML attributes around the Ruby. So we were kind of just putting this mask over it, removing all the tags around it. So you're just left with the Ruby code. And if you just have Ruby code, you can also use an existing Ruby parser to parse this code. And that's kind of what we did. We just stripped out the HTML around it, just have the Ruby left, and then we used that to build the basic integration for ERB files. This shipped thanks to Stan earlier this year. And if you haven't been using the Ruby LSP, I highly encourage to check this out too. They have this really awesome article from a few months back where they kind of summarized what they have been doing in the Ruby LSP. But coming back to this problem, this worked for the basic support, but in this process, we kind of lost the HTML context. And it's kind of important to know where you are interpolating in ERB documents. So if you look at this here, if you just interpolate a string at the top of the document, it doesn't really matter. But if you interpolate in between tags, it might have some security implications because you could insert some JavaScript, some vulnerabilities. You just have to be careful where you're interpolating. But if you just strip out all the HTML context around it, we don't really have any sense of where we are interpolating. So we have to know about where you are interpolating. And that's kind of why you want to support HTML with embedded Ruby more. Also because you can pretty much use ERB for whatever you want, right? It's just like a way of interpolating something in a text document. So you can use ERB for generating emails or for generating other things which aren't HTML. But what we need for making this better is a HTML-aware ERB parser. And I've been experimenting with this just so we can improve the ERB support in all of these tools, possibly more. But what it kind of tries to do is to understand syntax like this, where you have tag.div, where you have content tag, where you're using DOM ID, where you're using conditionals, where you're using tag.div with the data syntax and the hash, where you're using tag.p in this example and pass in a block, or where you have loops that generates a lot of HTML around it. And that kind of led me to think that we need a better abstraction for this. So these two examples are seen equivalent because in the end they are. This will just output a p tag the same way as if you would write it on the left side. But for us to implement a tool on top of that, we don't really care if it's the left or the right. We just care about if it's going to be a p tag or not. And that's something we just want to try to extract to make easier to work with this parser. Similarly, if you have these two examples here, these output the same Ruby syntax in the end, or the same HTML syntax. It's just a way different way of writing it. But since these values are all static, we can figure this out statically in a parser. So all of this needs a little bit more exploration, but I feel like there's something to it to make all of these tools way better. And I think if we do this the right way, we might also be able to support Haml, Slim, or other embedded languages more easily, because you just need to understand how these syntaxes translate into HTML. And if you can do that, we can build support for all of them. And if you do this, again, the right way, we might be able to extract a language service again, kind of what we did earlier with the HTML one. We just used it and we're able to build something on top of it very easily. But if you can expose this for the wider community on how you might be templating in HTML, we can provide these services and then everybody can just build tools on top of it, which is super awesome. And one more thing which I wanted to highlight here is the way we are rendering files, partials, views, components. Because I think we can also power more advanced diagnostics here, especially for stimulus. So if you think about this example here, where you have a controller at the outer level and some targets within it, you have to know that you have to put the target inside this element for it to work. If it's outside of it, it doesn't work. Stimulus doesn't give you any hints. So what we want to do is we want to say, if you use this target outside of this element, it's not valid. We want to show this to you. So this we can do today already. That's kind of doable. But as I said, the problem is today, modern Rails apps have components, have partials, have multiple views, and they are they might be split apart. So you have one file here, the other file there, the target is defined here, the control is defined over there, and we have no connection between these files. But if we know that this render call is rendering this view file, we can put them together, kind of stitch them together again, and give you more advanced diagnostics even across files. And that's super powerful for the usability aspect of these tools. So we have to build understanding into the parser to how Rails renders these view files. So if you kind of do this here, where you have the controller, where you render the file outside of this element, we can actually highlight this to you and say, there's something wrong here. You are using this target outside of the control element. And that's something I'm really excited about. That's super helpful. Just because I lost so much time debugging stuff like that, I didn't realize it's not the way you think it is. And that's if the editor just tells you at at the time you write it, you're so much more efficient. So that's why I think a advanced HTML ERB parser could prove super helpful. It could power these tools. And while I was researching some of this, I found some of these gems even could make use of that too, to make their lives easier on how they parse HTML and ERB. And possibly we can build a new formatter for formatting ERB on save really quickly. There was a HTML formatted gem for ERB, but I never got it to work for my setup as well. So I think we can build something which also works quite nicely without any setup. And I don't know, maybe possibly we can even build a more advanced ERB engine if we actually understand ERB so much in depth that we can build something more better for the modern day as well. Similarly, if you have been following the Ruby part of it, Prism has had a big effect on tooling in that landscape. And it just shipped with the Ruby 3.4 pre-release a few months ago, or no, last month actually. So that's had a big effect. And I think if we kind of do the same thing, we could have a similar effect on the ERB tooling in general across Rails and Ruby, but maybe even in the wider web community of how you might be dealing with statically rendering those view files. Okay, that's a lot, I know. So I have one more thing to show, which is a little bit more visual. So we have been working on a Hotwire browser extension as well for you to kind of inspect stuff that's happening in the browser. This kind of all sparked from this conversation on Twitter where Matt Swanson was showing that he had a CSS hack for highlighting turbo frames in his application. So you can see the blue outline and the frame with like the name next to it. And we just thought it's kind of annoying to copy this around, and that's why we bundled it up into a Hotwire browser extension. So you can download this today too. It works for all the major browsers. If it doesn't, please let us know. It gives you this panel where you can disable some of these features by yourself, kind of what you care about. And what it gives you is also like outlines for stimulus controllers of where they are defined. So the green outlines here are stimulus controllers. You can see where they have effect on the page and what they do. And if you kind of have this enabled and browse the web, you might also realize that Stack Overflow is using Stimulus for some reason. And you can see here they are using Stimulus for pretty much all the interactive pieces on the page, for upvoting, for following, for sharing, for searching, which is kind of interesting. And you can also see in the bottom right the control names of these controls they are using for powering this. So you can kind of just see and inspect what's happening on a website that uses Stimulus or Turbo. If you have been dealing with forms and Turbo, you might have spent some time there too. So we kind of built in some event logging so you know what's going on in a sequence of you submitting a form in Turbo. That's kind of useful. And I have some sneak peeks here to share too, which isn't released yet, but we have been trying to visualize Turbo frames and which parts of the page influence how a frame is being updated or rendered. So in this case here, you can see all the tabs on top are controlling this frame in the middle. So even GitHub uses turbo frames for most of their interactions, and all these buttons control this frame in the middle to advance or navigate the page. But as you can see here on this screen, it gets a little messy if you have too much going on. So we have to figure out a way to make this more, I guess, easy to navigate if you have a bunch going on. And something else we've been working on in StimulusReflex, which isn't happening in Turbo right now yet, but we had this outline on the page where you had like, if you click on this button, it would re-render this part of the page. It would re-render these views and partials, and it would update that part of the page as a reaction to it. And if you have all of that kind of put together and have it all in the browser, in the editor, I think you really have a good time building modern Hotwire and Rails apps. The, one more thing we had here was the debug bar for turbo streams. They are usually super quick to execute. So sometimes it's super hard to catch if something actually happened or if it actually executed or what it did. So we want to build in a debug bar so you can pause the execution of turbo streams just so you can inspect what's happening if it goes too quickly. And the other thing we had was a reload button for turbo frames. If you are kind of iterating over something, you can just click this button and refresh the page. I've lost some time doing that manually on the console, so I just thought we should add this to the frame directly. There's so much more we have ideas about. If you have any more ideas too, open an issue on the repo, and we might take a look and see if we can make it happen. As I said, it's all work in progress, so if you can break it, please let us know, and we'll try to fix it. So yeah, to conclude here, I think the whole developer experience and developer ergonomics matters. I think we in the Ruby community have been kind of putting this to the side a little bit. We always thought we have this head start of all the other ecosystems, but now I think they all catched up or even overtook us, and I think we have to kind of follow up now and have answers to these questions too. And I think these are the kinds of tools we have been missing to make it more productive and more fun to work with. And I think there's so much potential to level up even more than what I showed today. So I personally am super excited to see this tool come to life. And I also think that these tools are what make a language or framework stay relevant. Or if you kind of want to put it the other way, if a new person comes to our ecosystem, they expect these tools to be here. Otherwise, they feel weird if they are not. They just feel like, oh, they don't have any tools. Something is missing. Something is weird about this language. And that's not the feeling I want to kind of give new people that are joining our community. So I want to help improve this and make this happen. As I said, we have been lacking behind, I think, because I want to keep building Rails and Hotwire apps. And for that to be a future, I am trying to build these tools. So if any of this is interesting to you and you want to follow up more of what I showed today, I've been running this Hotwire weekly newsletter for the past year or so. And it's a newsletter focused on Hotwire. It kind of delivers every week on Sundays. It just gives a highlight of what's happening in the world, give updates on stuff we've built on hotwire.io. And yeah, if you want to subscribe, you can do this on hotwireweekly.com. We recently had the 1 year anniversary too, so it's been going for a while. So if you want to follow along online, we have the socials here or hotwireweekly.com. And all I have to say now, I want to stay in for a more productive Hotwire ecosystem and for a more unified Hotwire ecosystem. So that's all I have today. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was like a really, really great talk, to be honest.
Thank you.
Like, does anyone have any question?
I have a question about the TurboStream debug bar.
Sure, yeah.
So you said it is also like an in progress project, right? Is it like an extension, like browser extension, or how that
Yes.
works?
Yeah, it's a browser extension, so you can kind of install this in your browser. I mean, it's not live today, this one, not yet, but it will be in the same package. So you can enable the toggle for the browser, for the debug bar, and it will give you this floating toolbar you can kind of push around on your page and then stop the execution for the turbo streams. I assume you had some issues in the past too, so like where it goes too quickly to see what's actually going on. Yeah,
Yeah, this would be very useful when I was having some issues.
right.
Definitely.
Yeah, most of these tools and the features are inspired by the struggles I had in the past with dealing with debugging these issues. So it's not something I just thought about. It's something that actually I spent some time debugging and thinking this could be better.
Okay. And hi, I am Enes from eBookLab, and
Nice
I
to
have
meet you.
another quick question.
Sure.
And I think the Hotwire generally used by Rails application.
Hmm.
What do you think about how it is are hard to use the Hotwire with the other Ruby web frameworks other than the Rails?
If it's hard, or
Is it hard or how is it hard?
I think it's somewhat straightforward. So all you pretty much have to do is you have to um, set up the JavaScript part. So that's kind of, I guess, the most challenging part. But as soon as you can start the Stimulus application and you can import the Turbo start commands, you should be good. It doesn't require any more than that. And most of the Turbo interactions just expect that you return a full HTML page, and that's what most frameworks already do. So if you are visiting a new page with Turbo Drive, it will just fetch the page, update all the insights, and that should just work. The only problem that you might have is with the action cable and I guess the WebSockets with the updates, the live updates,
Mhm.
where you need some server-side counterpart to make it work.
Okay.
But as long as you just kind of care about Simulus, Turbo Drive, Turbo Frames, and Turbo Streams, without the broadcasting, it should be super straightforward to get started. Yeah,
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
you're welcome. Are you using it for any specific framework, or do you
Yeah,
have
we are using Roda
Rhoda? Yeah.
from the Jeremy Evans.
Yeah, I was just talking to him last week, and I was asking him how
Yeah,
he is managing JavaScript in Rhoda apps. And yeah, he didn't say, he said like he doesn't have any specific setup. So I guess as long as you can somehow just vendor the JavaScript part and import it in your head HTML tag, um, that should just work out of the box. Yeah.
Actually, the Jeremy Evans just joined our company 2 weeks ago, so I think he probably asked for that.
Are you working for
uBCloud.
right? Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I have one.
Sure.
Like when you were basically started, did you have to do any like tweaks here and there for different LSP clients, or was it all covered with the protocol there?
The only thing I had to do was VS Code, so it requires you to wrap it in a small, um, in a wrapper where you just start the language server from the client, and you have to publish on the marketplace so people can find it. But that's all it took, kind of just a small wrapper to start the server, and that's all it is. Yeah. And I guess you need some other setup a little bit more for, I guess, NeoVim, where you just have to say, here's the server executable, and here are the initialize arguments. But that's all you have to do there too. Just kind of set this up once, and then you should be good to go.
I'm a NeoVim user, so I know the LSP pains.
Right. Yeah, there's a we added config to LSP config for NeoVim. So if you use that, you should just be able to enable stimulus ls in your array of LSPs, and it should just do it automatically. Yep.
Any more questions? Okay, I guess then, um, well, thank you first of all, like joining us and having this great talk. It was really good.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
And maybe another topic on another week.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you for this great tools. Thank you for your
Thank you.
support
Yeah.
for the
Yeah,
ecosystem. Thank you.
if you have any questions or any kind of requests or are struggling with something, please feel free to reach out on any of the channels, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you.